My name is Vivienne Ashby. I am 71 years old. And on a Sunday afternoon in September, I was sitting in the sunroom of my house with a cup of tea and a very good book. I was reading a biography of Winifred Holtby, which I mention because the timing was apt in ways I did not appreciate until later, when I heard my daughter-in-law's voice carrying clearly through the kitchen window from the back garden, where she thought she was out of earshot. She was on the phone. Her voice had the particular unhurried confidence of a person having a conversation they consider private. And she said, in the tone of a woman who has already made her decision and is simply announcing it to a co-conspirator so they can begin coordinating the details, "Put the old hag in a home and take the mansion. It's what she's always been sitting on. We could list it by spring." I want to be precise about what I heard, because precision matters here, not old woman. Not mother-in-law, not Vivienne. Old hag. The specific language of someone who has ceased to see a person and begun to see an obstacle. And not take the house, take the mansion. The inflation of the noun was its own small portrait of her thinking. The house already enlarged in her imagination by the scale of her desire for it. What Celeste did not know, what neither she nor my son Elliot had any reason to know, because it was not information I had shared with them, or with anyone in the family, or with anyone at all except my solicitor, and the man I had shaken hands with 2 weeks earlier, was that I had already sold the house. Not listed it, not begun the process, sold it, signed, completed, funds in escrow, exchange date confirmed. Sold it to a development company called Mercer Holdings that had been after it for 3 years. And Mercer Holdings did not want it for its history, or its gardens, or the library my late husband had lined with books over 40 years. They wanted the land. 2.4 acres in a borough that had rezoned for high-density residential the previous January. They were going to knock it down. I did not go to the kitchen window. I did not put down my book. I took a sip of my tea, which had gone slightly cool, and I turned a page, and I thought about the Sunday 4 weeks from that one, when the exchange would complete and Elliot and Celeste would find out that the thing they had been planning to inherit did not exist anymore, and had not for some time. I did not feel angry. I felt, if I am being precise about it, something very close to peace. Before I tell you what happened on the Sunday, the exchange completed, and what was said at my dining room table before the house became something that no longer needed a table, I want to know where you are right now. What city, what country, what time is it where you are sitting or walking or making your dinner? Drop it in the comments below. I picture every single person who listens to these stories, and I want to picture you. And if you are someone who has ever been talked about in the third person in your own home, reduced to an obstacle in someone else's plan, written off as simply an item on an inheritance checklist, please subscribe and like this video. This community exists for exactly that. Now let me take you back to the beginning, because the Sunday in the sunroom was not the start. It was the moment everything I had been building quietly snapped into place. The start was years earlier, in the gradual, particular way that a marriage can reveal itself through the person your child chose to become while they were inside it. My husband Douglas and I had lived in Ashby House, which is what the neighbors called it, and eventually what we called it too, for 39 years. Douglas had purchased it in 1983, when we were both 32, newly married, and optimistic in the specific way of people who have just made the largest decision of their lives and have not yet been tested by it. He had been an architect, Douglas, which was not incidental to the house. He had an eye for structure and proportion that most people lose somewhere between childhood and adulthood, and he brought that eye to every room of the place, with the patience and thoroughness of a man who understood that a building was not a fixed thing, but a relationship. Something you had to keep working at. The house was a Victorian semi-detached on a wide tree-lined road in North London that had been carelessly maintained by its previous owner, a bachelor solicitor who had spent money on his suits and none on his plumbing. It had rotting sash windows and a kitchen that had not been modernized since approximately 1960, and a garden that had become so comprehensively overgrown that we found, in the 3rd week of clearing it, a stone bird bath that neither of us had known was there. Douglas saw the house and said, "This is the one." I said, "The one what? The one we need to spend all our money fixing?" He said, "Yes, exactly." He was right. We spent the first 4 years rebuilding it room by room, weekends and evenings, and the occasional desperate weekday when something structural required immediate attention, learning as we went, arguing pleasantly about tiles, and arguing less pleasantly about load-bearing walls. I learned to mix mortar. Douglas learned that I had very firm opinions about bathroom fixtures that were not to be overridden by budget considerations. We came to terms. By the time Elliot was born in 1988, we had a house that felt entirely ours, in the way that only things you have made with your own hands can feel not purchased but built, not given but earned. By the time Elliot was grown and gone, and building his own life, the house had become something neither of us could have predicted from the derelict semi-detached we had walked through on a rainy Saturday in October of '83. The neighborhood had become fashionable, which neither of us had arranged, but both of us had noticed with a certain mild amusement. The garden Douglas had planted along the south wall in 1991 had matured into the kind of garden that made people slow their pace on the pavement and look. The library had 4 walls of books, accumulated over decades, organized according to a system that only Douglas fully understood, and which I had spent 39 years quietly ignoring and secretly respecting. It was, in the language of estate agents, a substantial family home in a sought-after location. It was, in the language of our actual life, the place where everything that mattered had happened. Douglas passed away 6 years ago, in the January of the year he turned 67, from a pulmonary embolism that arrived without warning on a Wednesday morning when he was reading the newspaper in the kitchen in his dressing gown. He had made coffee. He had fed the birds in the garden, which he did every morning without exception, regardless of weather. He had sat down with the newspaper the way he sat down with the newspaper every morning, folded to the crossword first, which he always did in ink. He was found by our neighbor Margaret, who had come to the front door with a jar of the marmalade she made every January, because Douglas adored it, and she made it specifically for him. He had not finished the crossword. It was 4 across and 7 down, and I can still tell you the answers because I found the newspaper and completed it that evening because I did not know what else to do with my hands. The marmalade was on the counter. It was the 1st January I have bought my own marmalade since. After Douglas died, I continued to live in Ashby House alone, which became the subject of considerable and consistent opinion from several directions. Elliot thought it was too large for one person. This was a reasonable observation, delivered with an unreasonable frequency. Celeste, whom Elliot had married 4 years before Douglas passed, thought it was too large for one person in the specific way of a woman who is running a calculation, while she makes the comment, and whose calculation does not have my comfort as its primary variable. My sister Rosalind in Edinburgh thought I should move closer to family. My friends at the book group thought I should take in a lodger. My neighbor Margaret thought I should do exactly as I pleased and say so directly to anyone who thought otherwise. I agreed with Margaret. I always agreed with Margaret. I stayed in the house. I managed it. I tended Douglas's garden along the south wall. I filled the library with my own reading alongside his. I had 4 years of widowhood that were sometimes profoundly lonely in ways I had not anticipated, and often genuinely peaceful in ways I had, and which were entirely, without qualification, my own. Elliot came to visit on alternate Sundays with Celeste. These visits had a consistent texture that I had mapped and understood over years with the clarity of someone who has been reading the same kind of document long enough to notice when the language has shifted. Elliot would arrive and check the gutters, because he always checked the gutters, and ask about the boiler, and look at the garden with the expression of a man appraising something rather than enjoying something. Celeste would move through the house with the considered attention of a woman who is deciding what she would change. She would run her hand along the kitchen worktop and say, "This would be something with new cabinetry." She would stand in the doorway of the library and say, "All these books." "Elliot, imagine this as a proper sitting room." She said it the way people state plans, rather than express wishes, with the future tense of someone who has already decided the question and is simply waiting for the calendar to catch up. I would respond neutrally and steer us toward lunch, which was where I preferred these visits to spend most of their time. I want to be precise about Elliot, because I do not want this story to do the easy thing and make him simply a villain by association. He was not that. He had not become an unkind man, he had become a passive one, which is a different problem. He had been comfortable all his life, had been raised in a house that gave him everything he needed before he knew he needed it, and had acquired over time a kind of ambient sense of entitlement that was not aggressive, but was very real. The entitlement of a person who has never been required to consider that what they expect might not be forthcoming. He had married a woman who was considerably more strategic than he was, and who had, over a decade of marriage, quietly reshaped his sense of what the future was supposed to look like until her version and his were indistinguishable. He did not plan around me deliberately. He had simply absorbed Celeste's planning until it felt like his own. What made it specific, and what I want you to understand clearly, was not the fact of the expectation, but the manner of it. Celeste did not discuss the house with me. She discussed it around me, in the way you discuss arrangements for a room before you have bought the furniture, as though the question of the room's current occupant were already settled. She spoke about my future, when she spoke about it at all, in the passive voice. There was a care home she had identified in Surrey. It had an excellent reputation and gardens, and I would be very comfortable there. She mentioned it twice in the 18 months before the September Sunday, both times positioned as a piece of helpful information rather than a plan, but the positioning was thin. I could see the plan underneath it. I had been seeing it for some time. She had been using that language for longer than the September Sunday, as it turned out. My neighbor Margaret, who was 73, who had lived on the road for 41 years, who had brought the marmalade to Douglas that last January morning, and who had never, not once in our entire friendship, pretended to feel something she did not feel, had heard things over the years and had been waiting for the right moment to tell me. She came to my kitchen in the April before the September Sunday, sat down at my table with the direct manner of someone who has decided to stop sitting on information, and told me what she had heard. Celeste, on the terrace at Easter, on her mobile phone, voice carrying clearly across the garden wall. The house is just sitting there depreciating with a woman who doesn't need it anymore. She had said it without dropping her voice, Margaret said, the way people speak when they have forgotten that gardens have neighbors, and neighbors have ears. Margaret had heard every word. She had been sitting with it for 3 weeks before she concluded, I needed to know. I set down my cup. I looked at Margaret for a moment. I said, how long do you think this has been the plan? Margaret looked at her hands and then back at me with the directness I have always valued in her and said, I think the plan has been in place for some time, and that you are the last person in your own house to know about it. I sat with that sentence. Then I said, well, then I had better make my own. Margaret said, I was rather hoping you'd say that. We had another cup of tea. When she left, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, not with anger. I want to be clear that it was not anger, but with the quiet, firm resolution of a person who has been given the last piece of information required to make a decision she was already approaching. Let me tell you about Mercer Holdings, because this is the piece of the story that matters most, and the piece that Celeste and Elliot had every reason not to see coming. Mercer Holdings was a property development company based in Islington that had been systematically acquiring sites in the borough for the preceding 4 years in anticipation of the rezoning. They were not secretive about it. Anyone who read the planning notices in the local paper or attended the borough council meetings where the classification change was debated would have known they were active. They had identified properties on the road 2 years before the rezoning was confirmed and had begun making exploratory inquiries, which was standard practice for development acquisitions of this type. When the council voted in January to amend the use classification for the street, permitting high-density residential construction on what had been exclusively single-family dwelling sites, several houses on the road had received letters from Mercer within the month. Mine had received one in February. The letter was professional and clear. It explained who Mercer was, what they were doing, and what they would be prepared to offer for a voluntary sale. It included a figure that was described as a starting point for conversation, and which was, I knew from the research I had done in the months when the rezoning was being debated, approximately accurate for the land value under the new classification. I read it on a Friday afternoon at the kitchen table, and then I set it on Douglas's desk in the study, and I looked at it, not that afternoon, but over the 3 days following. with the particular kind of attention you bring to a document that you understand is asking a real question. The question was not whether the price was right. The question was whether I was ready to answer it. I called the number on the letterhead on a Tuesday morning in mid-February. The man who answered was Patrick Osai, the acquisitions director, and he had the quality that the best people in his position have, which is the ability to want something clearly without making you feel pressured by the wanting. He told me exactly what the land was worth under the new classification, and exactly what Mercer would pay for a clean, uncontested sale with an agreed exchange date and minimum conveyancing complications. He told me what the timeline would look like. He told me, because I asked him directly, what would happen to the building itself. He said the building was not part of what they were acquiring. They were acquiring the site. The structure would be cleared to allow for construction of the new development. He said it without apology or softening, which I respected because I would have seen through either immediately. I asked him to put everything in writing and send it to my solicitor. He said he would have documents to her within the week. He was as good as his word. My solicitor, Harriet Bloom, had been handling the Ashby family's legal affairs for 12 years. She was 55, meticulous, and had a quality I have always found essential in people I trust with complicated things, which is that she could receive any piece of information without registering alarm on my behalf before I had decided whether alarm was warranted. She reviewed everything Mercer sent and sent me her own analysis with 3 questions she thought needed answering before we went any further. I answered them over 2 meetings, one in late February and one in early March. By the 3rd meeting, in the first week of April, I had asked every question that needed to be asked, had been given answers I found satisfactory, and had arrived at the point of decision. I sat with it for 6 weeks before I signed. From the February letter to the May signature was 6 weeks of genuine deliberation, and I want to tell you about that deliberation because I think it is the heart of the story. I was not deciding whether to punish Celeste. I was not deciding whether to prove a point to anyone. Those considerations did not enter it, could not enter it. Because in February I did not yet know what Celeste had said at Easter. Margaret had not yet told me. What I was deciding, alone, in my kitchen, and in Douglas's study, and on walks through the park on cold February and March mornings, was whether I was ready to let the house become something that was no longer mine. Whether 39 years of building and living and losing was enough to constitute a completed thing rather than an ongoing obligation. Whether I was maintaining Ashby House because it was what I needed, or because letting go of it felt like letting go of Douglas again, and whether those 2 things were the same as I had been telling myself for 6 years, or whether they were different things that I had been confusing. By the first week of May, I understood that they were different things, that Douglas was not the house, that I carried him in ways that did not depend on postcode, and that a flat in Bloomsbury with morning light and a small balcony and no south-facing garden to manage alone was not an ending, but a beginning that I had been postponing out of loyalty to a version of my life that was no longer the version I was actually living. I signed the contract on a Thursday afternoon. I called Harriet that evening and told her. She said, "Very good." Those were her exact words, "Very good." It was exactly the right thing to say. The September Sunday, the one with the sunroom and the phone call through the window, was 4 weeks before the exchange date. I heard Celeste say what she said. I turned a page of my book. I finished my tea. Later that afternoon, Elliot and Celeste came in from the garden, and Elliot asked if I was all right, and I said I was entirely all right, and we had a very ordinary lunch. Now, if you are still with me, I need you to do one thing before I take you to the October Sunday. Leave a comment. Tell me where you are in the world and what time it is where you're sitting. And if you know this particular feeling, the feeling of overhearing yourself discussed as a problem to be solved by people who should have seen you as a person, tell me about it. Subscribe if you haven't already. This channel was built for these stories, and I read every single comment. The October Sunday is coming, and it is the moment everything I had kept quiet arrived in a room with everyone in it. I need to tell you about the weeks between the September Sunday and the October one, because they had a quality I want to describe accurately. They were not tense. They were not heavy with the weight of a secret I was struggling to carry. They were, genuinely, quite pleasant. I had a clarity in that period that I had not had in some time, the clarity that comes when you have made a significant decision completely and have only to wait for the appointed date. I tidied the library, which took 4 days and which I enjoyed thoroughly, wrapping Douglas's books in brown paper and labeling them for the storage facility Harriet had helped me identify. I began going through the objects in the house room by room, categorizing what would come with me to the apartment I had found in Bloomsbury, a second-floor flat with good light and a small balcony and absolutely no garden to maintain, and what would go to charity and what had no further use. It was the most purposeful I had felt in years. Elliot called on a Thursday evening in September, the week after the garden Sunday, to say that he and Celeste had been thinking about the house and whether we had ever properly discussed what the future might look like and whether we could have a family conversation at some point. I said that was a fine idea. I suggested the first Sunday in October, which I said was convenient for me. He said that worked. I did not tell him that the first Sunday in October was also the exchange date, which meant that when they arrived for lunch, the funds for the sale of the house they were planning to inherit would already be sitting in my account and would have been for approximately 4 hours. I want to tell you about Celeste because she deserves a complete portrait rather than a simple villain silhouette, and because I think you will understand the full shape of this story better for knowing her clearly. Celeste Ashby, née Merritt, was 43 years old, a commercial interior designer who worked from a studio in Bermondsey and who had a genuine eye for space and a real talent for her work, which I had always respected. She was sharp and organized and had a specific quality of energy that filled rooms when she was at her best. She had been good for Elliot in certain ways, had pushed him to be less passive than his nature inclined him toward, had organized their life together with a capability I recognized and appreciated. She had also, over the decade of their marriage, developed a relationship with the idea of Ashby House that had nothing to do with affection and everything to do with calculation. She visited it the way a surveyor visits a site. She walked its rooms with the consideration of someone measuring what they would keep. And she spoke about my future, when she spoke about it, in the passive voice of someone for whom that future was a logistical arrangement, rather than a life being lived. I do not believe she was malicious in the way that word usually means. I believe she was practical in the way that people are practical. When they have decided that an inconvenient truth about another person's autonomy is easier to organize around than to confront directly. She had decided, at some point, and with Elliot's passive compliance, that the house was theirs in all the ways that mattered except the legal one, and that the legal one was simply a matter of time and circumstance and the management of me. She had not considered the possibility that the management of me was not available as a service, because I was doing it myself. The first Sunday in October arrived, with the particular quality of autumn light that North London does better than anywhere I have lived, low and golden and slightly elegiac, the kind of light that makes everything look like something you are about to remember. I was in the kitchen at 9 in the morning when Harriet Bloom sent me a message confirming that exchange had completed and that the funds were in my account. I looked at the message for a moment. Then I made myself a pot of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, the table Douglas and I had bought at an auction in Islington in 1987, and carried up the front steps ourselves because the removal men had gone to the wrong address. And I thought about everything the house had held, and was glad it had held it, and was ready for what came next. Elliot and Celeste arrived at 12:45, on time, which was Celeste's influence. Elliot's natural punctuality ran to approximately 20 minutes late. They had brought a bottle of Burgundy, which was a nice gesture, and which I noted without attaching significance to it. Celeste had her hair done, which I noticed because she did not always bother for Sunday lunches, and I understood from that small, deliberate detail that today was an occasion she had dressed for. She had prepared for a conversation. You could see it in the quality of her attention when she came through the door, the specific alertness of someone who has rehearsed their opening lines. That told me everything I needed to know about the meeting she believed she was about to have. We had lunch first. I had made a roast because I had been making Sunday roasts in that kitchen for 33 years, and I was not going to alter the register of the afternoon in advance by changing the pattern of the day. We had the roast and a salad and the Burgundy, which was good, and we talked about Elliot's latest project, about a flat conversion Celeste was finishing in Shoreditch that she was genuinely excited about my sister Rosalind's recent fall and whether she needed more help than she was accepting. The conversation had the smooth, slightly pressurized quality of people who are circling a subject they have agreed in advance to address, but are observing the conventions of the meal before doing so. I recognized the texture. I let them arrive at it in their own time. I was in no rush. It was Celeste who opened it. I had expected that. She set down her fork with the careful precision of someone executing a planned gesture and looked at me with an expression that had been worked on. Concerned, earnest, the expression of a woman who had decided she was going to have a difficult conversation with love, and said, "Vivienne, Elliot and I have been thinking quite a lot about you lately, about your situation here, and we wanted to have a really honest conversation with you about what the future might look like." I said, "All right." She said, "This house, we know how much it means to you, and we know how much you've done to maintain it, but it is quite an undertaking for one person, isn't it? We've been worried about you." I said, "What specifically have you been worried about?" She glanced at Elliot, who had the expression of a man riding a horse he is not entirely sure he can steer. She said, "Just everything. Managing it all. Being here alone. There are some really wonderful residential options now. Nothing like what people used to imagine. Proper private residences, with all the support." I said, "You've identified one?" A small pause. "We did have a look at one in Surrey, yes, just to understand what was available." I said, "And the house?" She said, "Well, if you were settled and comfortable somewhere, it would make more sense for the house to be properly managed." I said, "Managed by whom?" Elliot said, "Mum." I said, "No. I'd like Celeste to answer." "Managed by whom, Celeste?" She looked at me steadily and said, "By us. We'd make sure it was properly cared for." I looked at them both. I want to tell you how that felt, sitting at Douglas's table in Douglas's kitchen, with the October light coming through the window Douglas had put in, looking at two people who had been planning around me as though I were already gone. I want to tell you, it felt like anger. It didn't. It felt like the confirmation of something I had already completed, like arriving at a destination and simply recognizing the address. I said, "I want to tell you something about this house. I sold it in May." The room went very still in the specific way that rooms go still when a piece of information arrives that reorganizes everything else in it simultaneously. Elliot looked up from the table. Celeste's hand stopped moving. I said, "I sold it to a company called Mercer Holdings. They are a development firm. They paid a very fair price for the land, which, as you may know, was rezoned for high-density residential construction in January." Celeste said, very quietly, as though the quietness might change what she had heard, "You sold it." I said, "I sold it. The exchange completed this morning. I have already begun moving my personal things to a flat in Bloomsbury, which I have taken a lease on. The completion date is 60 days from today, at which point I will vacate and Mercer Holdings will begin the process of demolition." Celeste said, "Demolition." Not a question, more like a word she was testing for meaning. I said, "They want the land for a development of 12 residential units. The house itself is not part of their interest." Elliot said, "Mom, you sold our house." I looked at him. "Your house," I said. "Elliot, this was never your house. This was my house, mine and your father's. And since your father died, mine alone. You have been a visitor here for 39 years. A welcome one, but a visitor." He opened his mouth. He closed it. Celeste had the expression of someone watching a plan she had built carefully over a considerable period of time dissolve in real time, and the specific quality of that dissolution was particularly visible on a person who had invested as much organizational energy in the plan as she had. She said, "You can't just, Vivienne, we had an understanding." I said, "What understanding was that?" She said, "That this was the family home. That it would stay in the family." I said, "What family were you thinking of? You have referred to me, that I know of, as the old hag. You have discussed putting me in a home to clear the path. I heard you. Through the kitchen window. On the Sunday 4 weeks ago." Celeste went white. Not flushed, not reddened. White. The color of someone who has just understood that a conversation she believed was private had an audience. She said, "I didn't mean..." I said, "You said what you said, Celeste. I'm not interested in the amendment. You were also on the terrace at Easter, on your phone, telling whoever was listening that the house was sitting there with a woman who doesn't need it anymore, Margaret told me. She heard you too." Elliot looked at his wife. Something shifted in his face. The specific shift of a man hearing a version of a story about someone he lives with that he genuinely did not know existed and is now having to absorb in front of his mother. He said, "You said that?" Celeste said, "Elliot, this is not the moment." He said, "Did you say that?" She did not answer. The table held the silence for a moment. I had not planned to produce it as a scene. I had simply decided that if the conversation arrived, I would be honest in it, and honesty, in situations that have accumulated over time, tends to carry more weight than anyone planned. I said I made the decision in February, long before I knew what you had been saying. I made it because I was ready, and because the house had become something I was maintaining out of habit rather than need, and because Douglas is gone, and I am not. I looked at Elliot. I loved this house. I love what your father and I built in it, but I will not be managed around it like a piece of the estate to be settled. Elliot said very quietly, "Mom, I didn't know she." I said, "I know. I believe you." I looked at Celeste. She looked at the table. I stood up. I said, "The roast was good, I think. There's more in the kitchen." Then I picked up my plates and I carried them to the sink. I ran the water. I stood at the window above the sink, the same kitchen window Douglas had put in, and I looked at the garden he had planted along the south wall, and I felt something I had not felt in 6 years, something wide and clean. Not triumph, not vindication, something simpler than both of those, something that felt like being completely free. The weeks after that Sunday had a texture I want to describe carefully, because I think it is the most important part of the story and the part most easily misread. Celeste did not speak to me for 3 weeks. She did not call, she did not write, she did not send a message through Elliot. I did not hear her voice until the Saturday in November. I did not spend those 3 weeks in any particular discomfort. I spent them packing, which was absorbing and occasionally emotional and entirely purposeful. Elliot called on a Tuesday evening, 4 days after the lunch. He said, "I need to understand." I said, "Which part?" He said, "All of it." We spoke for an hour and 20 minutes. It was the longest, honest conversation we had had in perhaps 10 years, and I mean honest in the specific sense that it had no performance in it on either side, and no navigation around the thing in the room, because the thing in the room had already been named, and there was nothing left to protect. He asked me about the February letter, about the 6 weeks of deliberation, about Harriet Bloom, and the meetings in March and April. I answered everything. He listened the way people listen when they are not preparing their response but genuinely absorbing what they are being told, which is a different quality of listening, and which I recognized because it was rare from him. I told him what I had heard through the kitchen window in September. I told him what Margaret had told me in April. He was quiet for a long time after the second one. Then he said, "I didn't know she had been saying those things." I said, "I believe you." He said, "But I knew what she thought. About the house." I let myself believe it was just practical thinking. I said, "Practical thinking about a person, as though that person were already a logistical arrangement, is something more than just practical thinking, Elliot." He said, "Yes, I know that now." He said, "I'm sorry, Mum," those 3 words. He said them, and I heard them, and they were real, and they were not sufficient to undo what had accumulated, but they were not nothing either. The thing about real apologies is that they do not solve the problem. They simply open the door to the question of what you do next. I told him the door was open. He said he understood. Celeste called on a Saturday in November at 11:10 in the morning from her own number rather than Elliot's, which meant she had made the call herself without being asked to. She said she had been ashamed of herself since the Sunday in October, that she understood I had no obligation to receive anything she said well, that she wanted me to know she understood what she had done. She did not say she had said it out of pressure or difficult circumstances, or because the property market had been what it was. She simply said she had been wrong and that she was sorry. I listened to all of it. I said, "Celeste, what I want from you going forward is not complicated. I want to know that when you sit in a room with me, you see a person making decisions about her own life, not a circumstance to be managed." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I did see you as a circumstance. I'm ashamed of that." I said, "Thank you for calling." I said it and meant it. The beginning of something different, if not the repair of something old. My flat in Bloomsbury is on the second floor and has a small balcony that faces east, which means the morning light in October is extraordinary, in the way that east-facing windows in October in London are extraordinary, filling the room with the low copper gold light that I grew up calling proper autumn, and which I had not had in my bedroom at Ashby House, because the bedroom there faced west. I discovered this as though for the first time on the first morning I woke up in Bloomsbury and found the light already filling the room and thought, I did not know I was missing this. I have thought about that small discovery many times since. The things you do not know you are missing until you go somewhere else. I assembled Douglas's books on shelves that I bought and had fitted by a carpenter recommended by the building manager, a young man named Joel, who worked with the quiet efficiency of someone who enjoys his craft and does not feel the need to perform it. The room smells the way rooms smell when they are full of old books and morning coffee and a person who has decided she is exactly where she should be. I walked to the British Museum on Tuesday mornings, not to see anything specific, but because the walk takes me through streets, I am still learning. And because learning a new geography at 71 is one of the more quietly satisfying things I have discovered you can do. I have lunch with Margaret on Thursdays when she comes up to town, which she does more often now that she has reason to. I have a son who calls every Sunday at 9 and who is, in the year since the October lunch, measurably more honest and considerably less managed than he was before it. That is not a small thing. Margaret sent me a photograph of the demolition site in February. The house was down, the site had been cleared. It was just land, brown and leveled under a gray London sky, with a hoarding around the perimeter, showing the artist's rendering of the 12 residential units that would be built there. I looked at the photograph for a long time. I looked at the bare ground where the south wall had been, where Douglas's garden had grown along the stone. I did not feel grief, which surprised me a little. What I felt was something quieter than grief and larger than acceptance, something that had the texture of completion. Douglas was not in that ground. He was in the books on the shelves in Bloomsbury, and in the crossword I still do in ink every morning, and in the marmalade I make now every January myself because I finally learned his recipe. He is not an address, he never was. I want to say something about the decision itself, because I think this is what the story is actually about, and I do not want to leave it without saying it as plainly as I can. I did not sell Ashby House to punish Celeste. I did not sell it to make a point. The sale was in motion before I knew the full picture of her planning, and it would have been the same decision if I had known. Because it was never about her. It was about me. It was about the difference between a life you are maintaining because it was once yours, and a life that is genuinely, presently, actively yours. It was about understanding, after 6 years of quiet and tending and loyalty to a place that held the memory of a person I loved, that honoring Douglas did not require me to stay still inside the house we had built together. That I could carry him with me into something new. That the new thing could be entirely, joyfully, without apology my own. I am 71 years old. I have a flat with east-facing windows and shelves full of books, and no garden to maintain alone. And on Tuesday mornings I walk to the British Museum in the autumn light, and I think, with a gratitude I have no language adequate for, that I made the right decision at the right time for the right reasons, and that it is mine in every way that matters. If there is someone in your family planning around you, discussing your future in the third person, treating your choices as a logistical delay in their own timeline, calling you a problem to be solved, I want you to hear this. Your life is not a waiting room for their inheritance. Your choices are yours to make at the time you choose to make them, for your reasons alone, on your own terms. The people who are waiting for you to step aside have forgotten that stepping aside requires the full and willing consent of the person doing the stepping. I did not consent. I moved, entirely on my own terms, somewhere wonderful, and I left them the land. Tell me something in the comments. Has there been a moment in your life when you realized someone had been planning your future for you without asking? What did you do? I read every single comment on this channel, and I want to hear every one. I will see you in the next story. Thank you, and I mean that in the way you mean something when you have had time to think about it. You gave this story your full attention, which is not a small thing. Vivienne's story is the kind of story this channel was built for. Not the loudest kind of betrayal, but the quietest and in some ways the most telling. the kind where the person who is supposed to be managed turns out to have already made her own arrangements. If something in this story recognized something in your own life, please share it with one person today who needs to hear it. And if you are not yet part of this community, subscribe now because we release a new story every single day, each one told with the care and the precision and the absolute refusal to treat a woman's choices as anyone else's property. The quietest comebacks are always built in silence. Thank you for being here. I will see you tomorrow.